We've reached the end of John chapter 13, and we've just seen Jesus predicting his betrayal by Judas, and now we come at verse 31 to another prediction. This time Jesus predicts his denial by Peter. Chapter 13, verse 31. When he was gone, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. If God is glorified in him, then God will glorify the Son in himself, and will glorify him at once. My children, I will be with you a little longer only. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I am going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give you, love one another as I have loved you, so you must love one another. All men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another." Simon Peter asked him, "Lord, where are you going?" Jesus replied, "Where I am going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later." Peter asked, "Lord, why can't I follow you now? I lay down my life for you." Then Jesus answered, "Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. Here's a famous passage dealing specifically with the Apostle Peter. But before we get to that point and how Jesus points out the weakness of Peter, a weakness which is reflected probably in each and every one of us, we have a commandment and a direction which Jesus presents us with. When he is gone, it said here in verse 31, by which he means, of course, Judas. Remember, Judas was told by Jesus to go and do what you needed to do quickly. And at that point, Judas left. And at that point, Jesus then said, when he is gone, Jesus said, "Now is the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him." That word "now" being crucial, because now the wheels have been set in motion. The events of the next few hours and days are now started off. It's as if the firing gun has been shot, and now the whole process is starting to play out. So now, says Jesus, now at this point, this is where it becomes impossible to turn it back. This is the point at which, with Judas having gone, set off to inform the Pharisees and the Jews that Jesus is ready to hand himself over to them, then now is the time when the events will be taken out of his hands. So now, but he says, now is the time for the Son of Man glorified, and God is glorified in him. Interesting. First of all, we've mentioned this idea of him referring to himself as the Son of Man. The Son of Man being a term which is significant not only of his humanity, but also of his deity. It wouldn't mean much to any of us to call ourselves sons of men, because that's what we are by nature. But there's something significant when Jesus applies that to himself. It's significant in the sense that here is a prophecy being fulfilled, and here also is a uniqueness which can only be ascribed to the deity of Christ taking on human form, Son of Man. And he describes the events which are about to unfold as the Son of Man being glorified. And the idea of glory is the idea of the outshining presence. The corona of the sun is the glory of the sun. It's the radiance which comes forth. It's something which pinpoints highlights the entire, it's like a spotlight going on to something. So the glory of something is spotlighting it and highlighting the event which is about to take place. Already he's spoken of the idea of the snake being lifted up in the wilderness, and the Son of Man will be lifted up in the same way. The spotlight will be trained upon Jesus in a way which no other spotlight has ever been trained before. And here he is giving himself up to that. And in the way in which he himself is spotlighted and exemplified in this way, so God himself is glorified in that act. And that's because Jesus says, God has sent me for this very purpose. We've seen that in the previous chapter. And therefore it's part of God's plan, and it's part of the plan which Jesus himself is carrying out. And therefore, if Jesus is being glorified, then the one who has planned all of this and executed it through Jesus is the one to whom the real glory belongs. And that is God. In other words, you stand back in wonder at such profundity of thought and idea that would set forth a sacrifice of such enormous magnitude, the sacrifice of the one that you love the best and the most dearest. In the same way that Abraham would sacrifice his son, so God himself would sacrifice his son too. There must be a very great purpose for such a sacrifice, and that is for the substitutionary atonement for sin. That's what is being said here, as Jesus himself says that he gives up his life for his friends. And so if the Son of Man is glorified, and God is glorified in him, and if God is glorified in him, then God will glorify the Son in himself and will glorify him at once. You see these conditional statements here piled up one on top of the other. If I am glorified, says Jesus, then God the Father will be glorified. And if God the Father is glorified, then he will glorify me in turn. And if I am glorified in turn, then I will be glorified at once. So he's viewing this entire execution, which is looming up within the next few hours, his being nailed to a cross and lifted up, as his glorification and the glorification of God. That's why, and some people ask the question, why do we think of Good Friday as good? You could call it Glorified Friday, because it's a time when the spotlight is on Jesus, which highlights his obedience to the Father, his submission to the Father's will, to the plan, which is extraordinarily costly to oneself, the plan to give up one's life for one's friends. Such is the extent of the love which is being shown here. And that cascade of conditional statements glorifying, and it will happen at once, says Jesus. And by that he means tonight, this very day. This is the time when now the Son of Man will be glorified at once. You don't have to wait much longer for it. It's happening today, at once. My children, I will be with you only a little longer, quite literally a few hours. He's looked at this time for the last 3 years, but as we anticipate events coming, they always come upon us. Even though it seems that they're a long way off, they eventually come, and we wonder where the time has ever gone. As you look back and you think, how quickly did that time go? How quickly did those 3 years with Jesus go? Because here now we stand at the threshold of the end of that ministry and the beginning of something completely new. My children, I will be with you only a little longer. He speaks of his disciples as children. He speaks, therefore, of himself as their father, as their shepherd, as their guardian, as their guide. It's a filial relationship that he has, in the same way that the Father is related to the Son. So he speaks of his own disciples as those who he is in charge of, in the same way that a parent is in charge of children. They will be lost and alone without him, but they have to grow up as all children do, and grow up they will, and grow up to replace the parent, as all children do. That's the nature of the child-parent relationship. The parent moves on, and the children leave, and the children grow, and the children, as they come to maturity, replace the parent in their role. That's a very suitable name then. My children, I will be with you only a little longer, literally a few hours. You will look for me, and just as I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. In other words, there is a dividing point here where I'm going to leave you. And you won't be able to come after me. People have been following me for many years now. When I moved from one side of a lake to another side, the people followed. When I went to this town, they followed. When I left and went to Jerusalem, they followed. Wherever I went, people have followed. You have followed me. Everywhere where I've been, you have been with me. You've come along with me. Crossing lakes, crossing deserts, crossing whatever was necessary from one town to another. You've been with me all the time. But now I'm going somewhere where you will be unable to follow me. That strikes them as being rather strange. I don't suppose they thought for a moment that their time with Jesus was coming to an end, despite the fact that he'd warned them many, many times that that would happen, that he would be taken and that he would be put to death, and the temple that would be destroyed would then be rebuilt in 3 days. So, you will look for me. Where I'm going, you cannot come. And that's the barrier that death produces. Whenever you cross from life to death, there is a barrier which is unbridgeable, unbreakable. You cannot cross over it. There's something which separates the dead from the living, and it's something which cannot be crossed. No one has come back from the dead, and no one has gone into the dead who has returned, except for maybe the one person that we're speaking of here, not counting Lazarus, who I think was a special case. But let's have a look at this, because he now points them to what they should do. The final few hours is spent in concentrating their minds on how they need to live from now on and what they need to do. And he says, "A new commandment I give you. Love one another as I have loved you, so ye must love one another." You might ask yourself, why is this a new commandment? How is it different from what has gone before? Well, I suppose that when Jesus was asked at one time, what is the sum of the law? What is the commandments? And the first commandment was to love God with all our heart, soul, mind, strength, and then to love our neighbour as ourselves. And that commandment, which summarized the entire earthly law from responsibilities from us to our fellow men, love your neighbour as yourself, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule as it's sometimes called. That law, that commandment, summarizes every commandment in the Bible. Now, that you might call the old commandment. But here, says Jesus, I'm giving you a new commandment. And the new commandment is different from the old one if you look at it carefully. The old commandment said, love your neighbour as you love yourself. But the new commandment I give you is love one another as I have loved you. So, old commandment, love your neighbour as you love yourself. But the new commandment, love one another as I have loved you. And automatically we see here a much higher level, much higher standard, a much deeper and more difficult task to do, a more commanding commandment. Something here which is on a different level entirely. To love your neighbour as you love yourself, well, that's of a certain standard and a level. You know, we love ourselves quite a lot. and there's lots that we would give up for ourselves as such. And to love someone else in that same kind of way, to love them as you would expect them to love you, that's the same kind of standard, which is a kind of the bare minimum. But Jesus says, if you love one another as I have loved you, well, what level of standard is that? That's a much more sacrificial standard. That's a sacrificing love, because the love which Jesus shows the disciples here is the love which will give up even his life for his friends. Greater love hath no man than this, that he lays down his life for his friends. And you are to love each other in the same way that I have loved you. So the lower standard of loving others as you love yourself is to be replaced with the new commandment, to love one another to the same extent as I have loved you. And I'm about to demonstrate to you very powerfully what that love means in terms of even laying down my life for you, for your benefit. A sacrificial love of the highest order. And that, says Jesus, no one can mistake. If you show that kind of love to each other, it will be renowned across the world. Because he said here, all men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another to that extent that I've loved you. This is the greatest kind of love that anyone can show another person, the kind of love which would sacrifice one's life for the other. And that's the kind of love which is a very rare thing, a very stand-out thing, something which you never ever see from day to day. It's possible you see it in the case of parents and children sometimes. Maybe, if circumstances are right, a parent sacrifices their life for their child. You often hear of cases where maybe a child falls into a turbulent river and the parent goes in after it, knowing full well it's very difficult to save the child, but nevertheless they manage to do so, but they're lost themselves. There are many cases like that where people risk everything. They go back into a burning building with regard nothing at all to their own life and safety in order to save and rescue someone else. That kind of sacrificial love which doesn't count the cost is the kind of marker here that Jesus is setting before his own disciples. If you want to follow me, said Jesus, then you have to live the way which I do. If you want to follow and be like me, then you have to do the kinds of things that I do. And here, before you, in the next few hours, I'll be laying down my life for you, and no greater love has anyone ever shown than that. And that is the way in which you are to love one another. The standard is immeasurably high. It's something we can only reach and grasp towards. But if the need calls forth at the right time, that's the kind of love I would expect you to show to your fellow brothers. All men will know that you are my disciples if you love one another. And that kind of sacrificial love was indeed evident down the ages, as many of these disciples did actually come to give up their lives for the sake of their faith in Jesus Christ and for the sake of their brethren within the church. Simon Peter is asking Jesus at this point, because he's picked up on the idea that Jesus is going somewhere and there's a separation going on, and Peter is so very connected with Christ. He doesn't want to leave him for a moment, and he's very impetuously strong-willed that he's committed his entire life to Jesus. So the idea that Jesus is leaving leaves Peter feeling suddenly not only bereft, but aghast and rebellious at that idea. I'm never going to leave you, Jesus. No matter where you go, I'm going to follow you. Simon Peter asked him, Lord, where are you going? As if to say, I don't want you to leave. And Jesus said, where I'm going, you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. Notice the subtle difference there between what was said earlier on when he said, As I told the Jews, so I tell you now, where I'm going, you cannot come. But when he speaks to Simon Peter, he realizes the deep connection, the love and the personal commitment that Peter has for him. This strength of bond between the two of them is so strong that Peter cannot bear the idea of being separated from Jesus. That's the nature of Peter's commitment. And so Jesus softens that blow of where I'm going you can't follow, as if it's just an abrupt thing. But as a concession to Peter, he points out that where I am going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. And that's to assuage some of Peter's concern and anxiety and his feeling of lostness and grief and bereftness, and being told that there will be a time when you will be able to follow me. But it's a time set in the future, and it's a time which has a painful and difficult approach. In fact, Peter does follow Christ in a very much the same kind of way. In fact, Peter, we're told by the historians, was crucified in the same way that Jesus was crucified, except I think in Peter's case he was crucified upside down, and that may have been more difficult or painful than even crucifixion itself. But Peter followed Jesus, and that promise was therefore kept. Where I'm going you cannot follow now, but you will follow later. And Peter asked, Lord, why can't I follow you now? I lay down my life for you. I'm so committed to you. The impetuousness of Peter is something which speaks to us, I would say. We see very clearly the connection that Peter has with Christ. He doesn't want to let him go. He can't bear the thought of having a life without him. He can't bear the thought of being far from his presence. And so strong is that feeling that he will commit himself entirely to Christ. But Jesus answered, will you really lay down your life for me? Powerful question. That's the kind of commitment that Jesus was asking for. That was the laying down your life for you. That's what Peter picked up on here. No greater love as any man that he laid down his life for his friends, which is why Peter says, I will lay down my life for you. I have that kind of love that you're commanding of us to have. I have that. But Jesus points out, it's very easy to talk about things like that. It's very easy to make ideas like that inside your head. It's very easy even to believe that it might be true. But when the moment comes, what kind of people are we really? Are we that kind of strong person that can do the things that we think we can do? Jesus points out there's often a big gap between what we believe of ourselves to be committed to and what we actually can do. And very often we fall far short of what we can do. Will you really lay down your life for me? I tell you the truth, before the cock crows, you will disown me 3 times. Rather than being totally committed to me and connected to me at every step, you will disown me to save your own life. That's the implication here. Peter is one of the most important characters in the Bible, I would say, because he shows that tremendous adherence to Christ, that impetuous desire to always be with him and to commit himself fully, and yet fails at that crucial point, as we all fail. Fails in the way in which all of us have ambitions to do the thing that we ought to do, and that gap between what we can do and what we want to do is always present with every human being. And Peter is quintessentially human in that. Impetuous, outspoken, bold, running to get to the place, to always be connected to Jesus, but embedded weakness and failure lie at the heart of him. And in that respect, he's the most important character because in Peter we can take huge hope from ourselves. Because if we see within ourselves the kind of failure that we see in Peter, then we can take hope from the fact that even Peter, even the one who is strongly committed to Christ, who failed at the crucial moment at that time, nevertheless, if Peter can be restored, then even if we fail, we too can be restored. Peter is a person who is enormously important, therefore, to the story of the disciples and to us and to our own discipleship. If we would want to emulate Peter and commit ourselves in that same kind of way, if you see the connection between Peter and Christ and feel that's the same kind of connection that we ought to have, and yet we fall over and stumble and end up effectively denying Christ and feeling that there's no way back from that kind of experience, then Peter becomes our rock in that sense. Because here is a person who has the strongest commitment, who makes the most grievous of errors, who denies Christ, not once, but 3 times, even before the dawn comes up, even before the cock crows, before dawn arrives, and it's late at night already, so within the next 6 hours or so. When the test comes, he fails that test. And that's a picture that we can all cling on to like that rock within a surging sea, where we have something to hold on to. And we can hold on to the fact that even if we fail, and fail abysmally, and fail more than once, then there is still hope, just as there was with Peter. Peter's story is important to us, therefore, to show that there's always a way back. There's always an approach that you can have, and that Jesus is always welcoming. We see later on, Jesus restores Peter 3 times. And that's something which should give us personally hope in the same way that it gave Peter restoration.